This is Nicole Carnival, and I am with Medical Physiology 1010 at the University of New England. Today I will be discussing the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion. The gastric phase of digestion takes place in the stomach, and this has three main functions, and they are storage, digestion, and defense. So digestion is basically chemically and mechanically the food that is entered into the stomach from the esophagus digests into a soupy substance called chyme. Defense, a small little brief description, is that it protects the stomach from bacteria and other pathogens that may enter by the food. So it starts at the end of the cephalic phase of digestion by the vagal reflex, and the vagal reflex kind of signifies the beginning of the gastric phase. The gastric phase is a series of short reflexes with the stomach lined with the gastric pits and gastric glands deep within the cell walls that are responsible for producing acid, enzymes, hormones, and paracrine molecules. So first, to talk about the storage of the stomach, when the food arrives from the esophagus, it arrives to a relaxed stomach that will expand in order to compensate for the larger volume of food coming in. This is called receptive relaxation. So the upper portion of the stomach is used to hold food until more food is ready to flow through the rest of the digestive system. If too much food flows through the stomach and then into the small and large intestines, it will overflow or overload the intestines. So the amount of absorption will not be a lot, and it would overwhelm the intestinal system. So the lower stomach is where the food actually is digesting. And there's a series of peristaltic waves that push the food down towards the pylorus. And the pylorus is the sphincter that goes into the small intestine. So in the lower stomach, with these peristaltic waves mix the food with acid and enzymes, which we will discuss. So as I had mentioned earlier, food particles are digested into a soupy mixture called chyme. So to talk about digestion within the stomach, gastrin is released from the gastric glands, and it's stimulated by distension, amino acid peptides, and also neural reflexes. The primary function of gastrin is to promote acid release, and we know that the stomach and the food needs a high presence of acid in order to digest the food. Short reflexes are mediated by the enteric nervous system neurotransmitter called gastrin-releasing peptide. So if you look at the diagram, at number 3, it says that the acid stimulates the short reflex secretion of pepsinogen, which we will talk about what pepsinogen is in a future slide. So acid secretion of digestion. There are parietal cells from the gastric glands that will secrete gastric acid, also known as hydrochloric acid, HCl, into the lumina of the stomach. Now this gastric acid can make the pH as low as 1, which is very acidic. The gastric acid has multiple functions. One is causing the release and activation of pepsin, which pepsin is the enzyme that digests proteins. Gastric acid triggers somatostatin release from D cells, and we will talk what somatostatin is in a future slide. Gastric acid also denatures proteins by breaking disulfide and hydrogen bonds. It helps kill bacteria, and it also inactivates the salivary amylase that had been used to start carbohydrate digestion that began in the mouth. The pathway of acid secretion happens from the parietal cell. Happens when the hydrogen ion from the water inside of the parietal cell is pumped through a hydrogen potassium ATPase pump. The potassium enters the cell in turn, and then from that concentration gradient that is created, chlorine can then follow the concentration gradient out of the cell. So enzyme secretion of digestion There are two main enzymes that the stomach produces. One is pepsin, which we briefly touched on before, and also there is gastric lipase. Pepsin is used for the initial digestion of proteins, and it's initially secreted by inactive enzyme something called pepsinogen, which is by chief cells in the gastric glands. However, when there's acid present, this stimulates the release of pepsinogen through short reflexes in the enteric nervous system, and that's when it becomes into pepsin, when it's cleaved into pepsin, which is an active form to digest the proteins. Gastric lipase is responsible for breaking down triglycerides and fats, and it's co-secreted with pepsin, and only a small portion of fat digestion occurs in the stomach. Most of the fat digestion occurs in the intestines. So paracrine secretion of digestion includes histamine, somatostatin, and intrinsic factors. Histamine meaning a paracrine signal secreted by the enterochromaffin-like cells in response to gastrin or acetylcholine. Intrinsic factor is a protein secreted by the gastric parietal cells that aid in the absorption of vitamin B12. And somatostatin is a hypothalamic growth hormone inhibiting hormone that's secreted by the B cells in the stomach. The somatostatin's primary goal is for negative feedback of the gastric phase secretion. So it shuts down the acid secretion and inhibits pepsinogen secretion. So somatostatin generally happens towards the end of the gastric phase so that it's prepped to go into the intestines, as the intestines are not as acidic as the stomach. Lastly, to talk about the last function of the stomach is protection. So the stomach has gastric mucosa that protects itself from autodigestion. Without a protective coat, what would stop the acid from digesting and the enzymes and from digesting the layer of the inside of the stomach? So acid and enzymes with mucus bicarbonate barrier are responsible for the protection, and the mucus provides the physical barrier, while the bicarbonate provides the chemical barrier. So this concludes the end of the gastric phase, and digestion will now continue into the intestinal phase.